As we start to get to the part of the day where the sun sets, I give great appreciation for these beautiful part of nature, the Garamagal homelands, also known as the northern beaches of Sydney. And the kookaburras, those birds that laugh, may start calling soon because it is getting towards dusk. And from where I sit, there's looking out at an estuary, which is a place where the salt water and the fresh water meet, where the rivers come down to the oceans. And like for all of us, the unifying aspect, whoever we are in the world, is nature. It's the sky, the rain that we share, the oceans that connect the continents. In fact, if we look at it instead of separate continents, we can see that we're a continuum of water. And then we have the animals such as the whales that do their annual migrations, which link us up. And we have the migratory birds that come from places like Mongolia and China down through the Yellow Sea to Australia and New Zealand and then back. So we have these movements of nature that don't define boundaries of countries. It's a unity of habitats and ecosystems. So acknowledging the Guringai people, the Garamagal people, the homelands, and the continuing care and culture and stories that help us connect to place. In the lineage that I have, I'm a relative newcomer to this particular continent, with roots in Ireland, the Celtic line, yet chose to be born and bred here. So when I look at nature, it is part of who I am. But what does that mean? It might mean that I just know to look and enjoy it. It might mean that I'm still learning to open my ears to really listen. What does that mean for us in terms of restoring the earth or caring for the earth? Well, let's say, take just one aspect of how nature helps us know how we can move to greater unity. Right here, this is called a sandstone woodland. Woodland meaning we have the large trees, but they're separated enough that the sun hits the ground cover, and we have a great diversity of plants here. It's like a wonderful musical orchestra where it's no one instrument that's the loudest. Each has its time and the part. And particularly right now with spring, and we have things like these flannel flowers, and you'll see the yellow flowers in the background. There's small purple flowers everywhere. It's like a symphony, and each flower, each plant, each species contributes its own music to what we're experiencing. Now, what we see on the top is this diversity. Nature shows us that it's not one tree saying, I'm the biggest and the best. Nature shows us that it's the what's called synergistic effects, so the working together. Many people were brought up on the idea of Darwinism or survival of the fittest, an idea of competition. Those who competed, those who succeeded for mates, those who had offspring would produce those particular offspring with those same characteristics, and it was those characteristics that would then make that species or that individual successful. Yet the more we look at nature, in fact, more common than the so-called competition of species is the behaviors that you could call loosely working together. There's many different ones, like they might say mutualism, where both mutually benefit. They might say commensalism. They both live next to each other. Useful, but not necessarily beneficial or not beneficial. We know parasitism, where one benefits to the seemingly detriment of the other. So there's so much working together as the natural way of an ecosystem, the natural way of nature. And we've talked about what's on the top here, yet the real magic is what's underneath. You may have heard of the Wood Wide Web. There's a wonderful Canadian who put together some information called Susan Smeaton, and her work showed that the underground is full of fungi. So you know a mushroom, but the mushroom roots are not like roots, they're like tiny, fine hairs. And indeed, the scientific studies have shown that in a forest, more than 90% of the biomass is these fungal hyphae. Hyphae is the name for the small roots, or you may have heard of the word mycorrhizae. Mycorrhizal is again that name for the roots. So when we use this word, wood wide web, we're talking about a web. Okay, it's wood because we're talking about plants, and it's definitely wide. While I sit in this forest, there is connections between every plant, between the soil itself. Every particle seems to have a connection with this wood wide web. Now, is this new information? We could say it's new to science. It's new that it's been tested and measured. But any conversation with traditional peoples will let you know that not only is there the acknowledgement that all of this is connected, but that we too are ultimately part of the wood wide web, part of the whole web. So what does this mean for unity? What does this mean for where we're at in the globe right now? Obviously there are things to care for in terms of Earth. There are things to care for in terms of humanity. There are things to care for in terms of plants, animals, systems, rainfall, clean water. And when we look to nature, there are simple solutions. So one thing that comes quite obviously is that when we say there are things that are benefiting each other, it's not necessarily, I'll give you nitrogen if you give me phosphorus, or I'll give you nutrients if you give me a home. What we find is this beautiful complexity where it could be, for one example, there's an orchid which actually doesn't have its own leaves. It doesn't photosynthesize. It itself is parasitic in terms of how it gets its core energy. So its roots go into that of a tree close by, and it takes the sugars, albeit probably not a lot for the size of the orchid relative to the tree. Then that orchid is the place where a very small insect called a gnat is able to well, not only pollinate the orchid, but to get food resource. That gnat breeds in the mushrooms that come up along the creek line. The breeding of the gnats occurs, and the pollen is also spread around. Well, not pollen from the mushrooms, but if it's in the mushrooms, it's the spores of the mushrooms that are coming out, and it's able to spread the pollen of the orchid as it moves from one orchid to the other. So this is a really very small example, but if you weren't watching or listening or knowing the stories for thousands of years, you may miss this beautiful, intricate nature of how things are weaving together. Another example is butterflies. Butterflies have so many teachings, and again in the sandstone bushland, what we have is a butterfly called the Moonlight Jewel. And for those of you who are David Attenborough fans, and I must say it's very exciting to see that once he got on Instagram, it was the fastest Instagram following ever. And that says something to me. It says people love nature, and people love people who, like David Attenborough, have given his life focus to bringing the joys of nature, and now bringing the awareness of how we care for it. Anyway, the Moonlight Jewel is a butterfly with some brilliant blue on it, and it's about that size. And this particular association is between the butterfly, some small black ants, and a wattle tree. And in Australia, the wattle tree is one of the symbols of Australia. You'll see it at the Olympics, the so-called green and gold. The gold is the wattle, the beautiful yellow flower. Now we have more than 500 different types of wattle. And again, that's another demonstration how diversity is the norm. So there's a particular type of wattle, one of these 500, that the butterfly's caterpillars like to eat. But so the caterpillars aren't out there exposed. Somehow, in the divine order of things, the ants and these caterpillars have an association. So the ants will herd the caterpillars out during the day, or the evening as well, and the caterpillars will eat on the wattle's leaves. The ants then herd them back in, the caterpillars, inside and underneath where the ants live, so they're safe from predators. Then at the time when the caterpillars are ready to transform to butterflies, the caterpillars again will be on a tree, and this is where I saw them one day, all over the tree. And my first glance thought, oh dear, these ants are attacking the caterpillars or attacking the butterflies before they even get to emerge. But it was important to stop and look, really take in the full information. And from that I was able to see, rather than attacking, they were protecting. They were running up and down each of the cocoons, making sure there was nothing there causing problem. And in time, the butterflies themselves would push open the cocoons, and while they were hanging from the wattle tree drying, the ants continued to run along the branches, making sure there weren't other things that were going to come and impact on the butterflies. And so one may say, wow, that's, it is wow. And just it is wow. But it just takes that looking to realize that there are these cooperations. There are links that are not direct, one for one. There's a whole lot of diversity. So how does that mean we can move forward in society, move forward as unity, learning from these attributes? So we can learn that diversity is a natural way. We can learn that sharing need not be, I give you this, so you give me that. We can learn that irrespective of size, there is a role. Everything has a role. If it has a life, it has a purpose. And then we bring that back to ourselves as well, to know that we are part of all of this. So if you're ever feeling alone, even if it's just the sky that you can see, know that that sky is connected to other things. In alignment with that, there's the ability then to see that interactions are our normal way. Connections are our normal way. Knowing that we don't have to be somebody else. Within that is bringing a feeling of okay about ourselves, preferably a feeling of joy about ourselves. Because as I mentioned, we are all connected, and the ancient wisdoms and the modern science shows that. And there's plenty of information that can be shared on that. But a little bit of the biochemistry of how do we do it? I know in my own life there could be times, have been times, when I've noticed a habitual thought. I've noticed a little voice in there that hasn't necessarily been the one that's most uplifting. And without knowing the science of it, I may have listened to that voice, and at times I did. But then knowing that a particular repeated thought that may have come from a childhood time, may have come from a particular event, resulted in a chemical change, and then my cells getting used to that chemistry. It's up to me to do a stop change. And it might be, for example, I'll play the song Frozen, the song from Frozen called Let It Go. And if I find the internal dialogue being negative, I'll play the song. Let it go, let it go. I'm one with the wind and the sky. It's actually a wonderful song. I love that so many young people love it and sing it. So today, it's about expressing the joy of nature, expressing that nature already does show us that we are all connected. And for those of you who are working in environmental rehabilitation projects, there's so much that we can learn from each other. So let's move forward in knowing that while there is the term you may have heard, death by 1,000 cuts, which is what has been spoken about in terms of we can lose the environment in little pieces. One unit block there, one road here, a set of shops there, and we lose it. Likewise, we can bring nature back. So let's look at bringing nature back to our urban areas, because more than 50% of our population live in a very urban area or a city. So the small acts that we do can add up massively to bring nature back to our urban areas. And with nature, the teachings. For example, the teaching of the butterfly. We have the butterfly, as we mentioned earlier, but just that process of pushing through a cocoon. So when we see a butterfly, it allows us to remember the story that says even though something may seem really, really hard right now, and we do need to push and we do need to push, it's through the pushing and pushing against that cocoon that allows the fluids inside the wings to really get the pressure, so that when the moment comes, the cocoon can burst open the wings can come out and they can dry in their full glory, and we can fly. So at this time, we may look around and see that there's like a tight cocoon. How do we get to this next part? How do we visualize a future where we have unity, where we appreciate the abundance of the earth? Right now, there's enough food for everyone. There's enough clean water for everyone. There's enough ways in which each of us can have a meaningful contribution. How do we get there? We first have to vision it, and then know that, like the caterpillar transforming into the butterfly, there is a time of pushing through a cocoon. And I dare to say that right now is one of those times of pushing through the cocoon. So whatever you can do in your own personal life, to know that the pushing through is part of it. To allow someone else to push through their own information, while maybe like the ants, you can keep away the predators and things that might impact on them in a fragile time, but allow them to come out themselves. It could be that you're part of the visioning. How can it look? And through that thinking and feeling how it can look, you're assisting in creating it. So from Sydney, Australia, from this beautiful bushland, with the sounds of the rainbow lorikeets in the background, as the sun starts to go down, I know that it's the collective of all the thoughts and the feelings that make this difference. I appreciate everyone that's come together at this time. Every acknowledgement of nature, and in the words of a wonderful elder, may your eyes see and know 1,000 beautiful things, and your hands hold 100 sacred objects. And as you look around, you see great beauty in all you see.